After years of caring for my sick mother, the lawyer smiled sadly and said, she left it all to Nick. She said he was her only real son. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would still be here, living in my childhood home, listening to the ticking of the same dusty grandfather clock and the soft groans of the same worn wooden floors, I would have laughed and said you had me confused with someone else, because back then I had plans, you know? Big ones. I was going to move to the city, start my own graphic design firm, maybe get a little apartment with big windows and a cat who ignored me unless it was hungry. I wasn't supposed to stay in this town, on this street, in this house. But life, as it tends to do, had other ideas. It started small like it always does. First, it was the forgetfulness. Mom losing her keys, misplacing her reading glasses, asking me the same question twice in an hour. Then it was the bills stacking up unopened, the burnt dinners, the bruises from little trips and stumbles she couldn't explain away with her usual stubborn pride. By the time I realized how bad it was, she was already slipping through my fingers. I tried to juggle both worlds at first, my job and Mom's care, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. I'd show up late for meetings, my mind back home worrying if she'd left the stove on again or wandered into the street like she had that one terrifying afternoon. The final straw came when my boss called me into his office, closed the door, and told me in that syrupy, fake sympathetic voice that they were going in a different direction, and my services were no longer needed. Laid off. Just like that. So I packed up my cubicle, drove the 2.5 hours back to the house I swore I'd never return to, and moved in with Mom, just for a while, until we could figure things out. That was 8 years ago. If you've never been a caretaker, it's hard to explain what it does to you. There's the obvious stuff, sure, the exhaustion, the endless doctor's appointments, the humiliating bureaucracy of Medicare and insurance battles. But there's something quieter too, something that eats at you from the inside out. You start to forget who you are outside of them. You start measuring days by medication times and bathroom schedules. You start shrinking slowly, invisibly, until you're just a shadow. I don't say this to blame her. She didn't ask for this any more than I did. Mom was a tough woman, all sharp edges and calloused hands from years of factory work and late nights sewing clothes to make ends meet. She raised 2 boys mostly by herself after Dad bailed when I was 7. Me and my older brother, Nick. Nick, the golden child. Nick, the one who got out and never looked back. At first, Nick called sometimes from whatever shiny city he had planted himself in that year, Miami, Seattle, New York. His voice always just a little too bright, too loud, like he was talking over a party he didn't want to leave. "How's Mom doing?" he'd ask, not really waiting for an answer. "You're a good man for being there, you know. I couldn't do what you're doing." I used to think that was gratitude. Now I'm not so sure. The calls got fewer over the years, the excuses more elaborate. Busy quarter at work, new girlfriend, things are complicated, planning a move, you know how it is. I stopped expecting him to show up for holidays after the third Thanksgiving where Mom sat in her nicest blouse at the kitchen table, craning her neck at every sound like maybe he'd come through the door. He didn't. Still, I made it work somehow. I got a job at the local hardware store, part-time, no benefits, but it was something. I taught myself to navigate Mom's moods, the long stretches where she was lucid and almost herself, the sharp, scary moments where she wasn't. I kept the house standing, barely, patching leaks with duct tape and hope, paying what bills I could, rationing medications when the insurance company decided something wasn't necessary, after all. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was just life. Our life. And somewhere along the way I stopped thinking about getting out. This was where I was needed. This was where I belonged. Or so I thought. About a year ago, Mom's health took a sharper turn. She started falling more often. Started forgetting my name. Started talking to people who weren't there, her own mother, long dead, sitting at the foot of her bed, a neighbor boy from down the street who had moved away when we were kids. The doctor said it was the natural progression, that we had been lucky to have as many good years as we did. Lucky. Right. Try telling that to someone cleaning up after their mother like she's a toddler again, spoon-feeding her oatmeal and trying to convince her to swallow her pills because she thinks they're poison. Try telling that to someone who wakes up at 3 a.m. to the smoke alarm because she forgot she wasn't allowed to cook anymore. Try telling that to someone who stares at the ceiling at night wondering if this is all there is, if this is how the story ends, not with a bang or a triumph, but with a slow, endless fading. Still, I loved her. God help me, I loved her. Even when she was mean, snapping at me like a cornered dog. Even when she forgot my face but remembered Nick's, always Nick's. "Where's my good boy?" she'd ask sometimes, confused, scared. "Where's Nick? He promised he'd come home." And I'd smile and say, "Soon, Mom. He'll be here soon." And I'd lie awake afterward, hating him, hating myself, hating the cruel twist of fate that made me the one who stayed but left me invisible in her fading mind. 6 months ago Mom took a bad fall. Broke her hip. After that she never really came back. The hospital stay was long, brutal, and the rehab facility they moved her to afterward was worse. A cold, fluorescent purgatory where overworked nurses treated her like just another room number. I visited every day. Every single day. Sat by her bed, held her hand, read her the same old paperbacks she used to love, even when she just stared past me like I wasn't there. Nick didn't come. Nick didn't call. Not even once. The end, when it came, was almost merciful. One morning, I walked into her room and knew before I even touched her hand that she was gone. The nurse offered me a tissue. The doctor offered me condolences. The administrator offered me a stack of paperwork. And just like that, it was over. 37 years of life. 8 years of caretaking. Done. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, a couple of old friends from her sewing circle. Nick didn't show. He sent flowers. Lilies, expensive ones, with a card that said, "Wishing you peace." I almost laughed when I saw it. Almost. The lawyer called a week later. Said we needed to meet about Mom's estate. I almost didn't go. What was there to settle? The house was falling apart. The bank account probably had enough to cover the funeral and maybe a couple months of back taxes. But I went anyway because I'm nothing if not stubborn. I wore my only decent jacket, combed my hair, and walked into that musty office like I wasn't already broken into 1,000 pieces. And that's where it started. That's where the real story, the real betrayal, began. But of course I didn't know it yet. Not then. I still thought I knew how this story ended. I still thought I understood what Mom had left behind. I still thought I mattered. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and despair, the kind of place where dreams came to die, and the receptionist barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when I pushed open the door, the little brass bell above it jangling in a way that set my already frayed nerves on edge, and for a second I stood there stupidly, wondering if maybe this was a mistake, maybe I should just walk out and leave it all where it lay, let the past bury itself without my help. But then Mr. Lawrence, balding man in a sagging suit who looked more like a tired substitute teacher than someone entrusted with people's last wishes, poked his head out from a side door and called my name in a voice that suggested he wasn't thrilled to be here either. I followed him down a narrow hallway lined with framed diplomas and faded motivational posters. The harder you work, the luckier you get. Into a cramped office where the blinds were half closed against the gray light outside, and sat down in the only chair that didn't look like it would collapse under the weight of a heavy sigh, clutching my hands together so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. Mr. Lawrence cleared his throat, rifled through a thick manila folder, and launched into the kind of boilerplate legalese that makes your eyes glaze over, something about probate, and executors, and distribution of assets, none of which I really cared about because none of it mattered, none of it could undo the last 8 years of my life, none of it could bring her back or fix the parts of me that had broken trying to keep her whole. I nodded along dumbly, waiting for him to get to the part where he handed me the keys to the house or the final bill for unpaid property taxes or whatever grim administrative chore awaited me, but then he said a name that made my stomach drop through the floor like a stone thrown into a dark, bottomless well. Your brother, Nicholas. I blinked, sure I must have misheard him. Sorry, I said, my voice sounding small and stupid even to my own ears. What about Nick? Mr. Lawrence gave me a look that managed to be both pitying and impatient, like he was explaining long division to a particularly slow child, and repeated, slower this time. Your mother left the entirety of her estate to your brother Nicholas. The words hung in the stale air between us, absurd and obscene, like graffiti scrawled across a tombstone. I opened my mouth to argue, to protest, to say, no, that's not possible, you don't understand, I was the one who stayed, I was the one who held her hand through every hospital stay and wiped her mouth when she was too weak to eat and cleaned up after her when her body betrayed her. I was the one who gave up my life for hers, not him, never him, but no sound came out, just a dry, strangled gasp. Is there a mistake? I managed finally, my throat raw. Mr. Lawrence shook his head with the weary certainty of a man who has seen too many families ripped apart by pieces of paper. I'm afraid not. The will is very clear. Everything, the house, the accounts, the insurance policy, all of it was left to Nicholas. He slid a copy of the will across the desk toward me, the paper crisp and final in a way that felt almost cruel, and I stared at the neat black letters of her name, Patricia May Collins, and then at the cold, impersonal language that handed my entire life over to someone who hadn't even bothered to show up for her funeral. I wanted to flip the desk. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the will into 1,000 shreds and shove them down Mr. Lawrence's throat. Instead, I sat there, swallowed it, nodded, because what else could I do? The dead don't change their minds. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember unlocking the door. I just remember standing in the middle of the living room, our living room, the one I had scrubbed and vacuumed and decorated for Christmas every year even when it was just me and Mom sitting side by side in companionable silence, and feeling like a stranger in my own life, like everything around me had shifted half a degree sideways, just enough to make the world wrong in a way you couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. Nick, who hadn't lifted a finger for her in years. Nick, who had missed birthdays and Mother's Days and phone calls and chemo appointments. Nick, who didn't even send a proper card for her birthday last year, just a lazy text message with a balloon emoji. Nick, who now owned the roof over my head, the ground under my feet, the memories that clung to these walls like smoke. I laughed then, a sharp, ugly bark that startled even me, and sank down onto the threadbare couch with my head in my hands, because what else was there to do? What else was there to be? The next few days passed in a blur. I went to work, stocked shelves, rang up 2x4s and paint cans and weed killer for people whose lives hadn't just crumbled into dust, went home, ate cereal for dinner straight from the box, stared blankly at the walls until sleep dragged me under like a drowning man. Nick didn't call. Nick didn't text. Nick didn't show up at the door with apologies or explanations. Nothing. Just silence. The same silence he had gifted Mom for years. It was Amanda who finally broke me out of it. Amanda, my old neighbor from down the street who had once babysat Nick and me when Mom picked up extra shifts, who had moved back after her divorce to help her aging father, who had seen too much and said too little for far too long. She knocked on the door one evening, holding a casserole dish in one hand and a wary, worried look in her eyes, and when I opened the door she didn't say anything, just set the dish down, wrapped her arms around me, and let me sob into her shoulder like a child. Later, over reheated lasagna and 2 beers apiece, she asked me the question that had been rattling around in the hollow cage of my chest since the reading of the will. Did you ever wonder why she favored Nick so much? I shook my head. Of course I had. But I never said it out loud. Because admitting it felt like betrayal. Even thinking it had felt like treason. Amanda watched me for a long moment, then said very softly, I don't think it was just favoritism. Something about the way she said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she just shook her head and squeezed my hand, her fingers rough and warm. Just, be careful, she said. And then she left. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed that still had the same creaky mattress from my teenage years, I replayed her words over and over in my head. Not just favoritism. Be careful. I thought about the way Mom's eyes had lit up whenever Nick's name was mentioned, even long after she forgot mine. I thought about the way she used to hush me when I complained about Nick's broken promises, his selfishness, his absence. He's doing important things, she would say. He's got his own life to live. I thought about the boxes in the attic, the ones I hadn't touched in years, the ones that held the brittle, yellowed skeletons of our family's past. And I thought for the first time that maybe there were things about my mother, about Nick, that I didn't know. Things I had never wanted to know. But now I had no choice. Because the past wasn't done with me yet. Not by a long shot. And something deep in my gut, something old and scared and furious, told me that whatever I found next was going to hurt more than anything I had already endured. But still I had to look. I had to know. I had to. The thing about memories is that they lie not in the way people do with words and intentions, but in the quiet, traitorous way that they shift at the edges when you're not looking, softening the hard parts and sharpening the bright ones, sanding off the splinters so you can keep carrying them without bleeding all over everything. And I think I spent a long time, maybe my whole life, choosing to remember my childhood the way I needed it to be, not the way it really was, which is probably why. Standing there in the dusty attic with a flashlight balanced between my teeth and a growing knot of dread tightening in my stomach felt a little like stepping into a crime scene where the blood had been scrubbed away but the stain still lingered if you knew where to look. I don't even know what I was searching for at first. Answers maybe. Closure if such a thing even existed. Or maybe I just wanted to find some scrap of evidence that would tell me the lawyer had been wrong, that Mom hadn't betrayed me after all, that there was some mistake buried in the paperwork, some technicality that would snap everything back into place like a bone reset after a bad break. The attic was a mess, cluttered with decades of junk, cracked Christmas ornaments, yellowed newspapers, boxes of clothes nobody would ever wear again, but tucked away in the farthest corner, half buried under an old tarp that smelled like mildew and lost time, I found a battered cedar chest I hadn't seen since I was a kid. It was locked, of course. Of course it was. But the key, funny enough, was exactly where it had always been, hidden in the false bottom of the nearby sewing kit Mom kept in the laundry room, The same one where she used to patch the knees of our jeans and sew buttons back onto Dad's shirts before he vanished like smoke into the wide, uncaring world. I opened the chest with hands that didn't feel like my own, expecting, I don't know, old photo albums, maybe some keepsakes, the sentimental detritus of a life spent trying and failing and trying again. What I found instead was paperwork. Stacks and stacks of it. Bank statements. Tax forms. Hospital bills. And tucked between them, like a viper coiled in tall grass, a slim black binder labeled in Mom's careful, fussy handwriting, Nicholas, important. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs as I flipped it open. Inside were certificates, awards from his elementary school, soccer trophies, glowing report cards with syrupy comments about leadership potential and natural talent, none of which I remembered because Nick had always been the one who hated school, who skipped homework, who spent more time sneaking cigarettes behind the bleachers than studying. There were newspaper clippings too, articles about scholarships and internships, none of them real as far as I could tell, but carefully cut out and pasted into the binder like proof of a life that only existed in the scrapbook of Mom's mind. And then, tucked into the back pocket of the binder, there was a letter. A real letter. From Mom. To Nick. Written the summer I turned 15, the summer Nick disappeared for good. My dearest Nicholas, it began, the paper thin and brittle under my fingertips, the ink faded but still legible. I know it must have hurt what happened with your father. It hurt me too. But I want you to remember something no matter what anyone says, you are destined for great things. You are the best parts of me and the best parts of him, and even if the world doesn't always see it, I do. I will always fight for you. I will always believe in you. You are the future of this family. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt that. You have to go, I know that now. Staying here will only drag you down. But when the time comes, when you are ready, everything I have will be yours. It's already yours in my heart. Take it. Build something better than I ever could. You deserve it. I read the letter 3 times before I could even process it, the words swimming on the page like oil on water, and each time I finished, the same sick, sinking feeling gnawed deeper into my gut. She hadn't just favored Nick. She had chosen him. A long time ago. Before the sickness. Before the dementia. Before any of this. She had decided that he was the one worth saving, worth sacrificing for, worth giving everything to. And me? I wasn't even a footnote. I sat there on the attic floor for what felt like hours, the binder heavy in my lap, the dust settling around me like ash after a fire, and I thought about all the little moments that suddenly made a different kind of sense. The way she used to light up when he called, the way she downplayed his mistakes, the way she pushed me to be understanding every time he hurt her, every time he hurt me. It wasn't just favoritism. It was something deeper. Something worse. An inheritance of love, bestowed long before money ever entered the equation. Over the next few weeks, I tried to pretend like nothing had changed. I went to work. I paid the utility bills. I raked the leaves in the front yard. I smiled at the neighbors. But inside I was rotting. Eating myself alive with questions that had no answers. Why wasn't I enough? What had I done, or not done, that made her decide I wasn't worth saving? And if she had already chosen Nick so long ago, why had she let me stay? Why let me waste my life holding her hand through the end? Why not send for him, beg him to come home, crown him with the reward she had promised? Unless she knew he wouldn't come. Unless she knew he never really cared. Unless she had needed someone, anyone, to pick up the pieces while she waited for a savior who would never arrive. And I had been convenient, disposable, useful, until the end. Amanda stopped by again one evening, her arms full of groceries I hadn't asked for and didn't deserve, and when she saw the look on my face, the hollow, ragged thing I had become, she sat me down at the kitchen table and poured us each a stiff drink without asking. You found something, she said, not a question. I nodded, showed her the binder, watched her mouth tighten into a thin, grim line as she flipped through it. I thought so, she said finally, setting it down like it burned. There's more, isn't there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe she wasn't going to answer, and then she said the thing that cracked the world open beneath my feet. There are things about your mother, she said quietly, that you don't know. Things she didn't want you to know. Things Nick knew. Things he used. I stared at her, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. What things? Amanda shook her head. I'm not the one who should tell you. Then who? She hesitated. And then she said a name I hadn't heard in years. A name I had buried along with every other piece of my childhood I couldn't bear to look at. Mrs. Denton. Our old neighbor. The one who used to babysit us sometimes when Mom worked nights. The one who had packed up and moved away under circumstances nobody ever talked about. "You need to talk to her," Amanda said, squeezing my hand. And for the first time real fear took root in my chest. Because the way Amanda said it, the way her voice trembled just slightly on that final word, told me that whatever secrets Mom had buried weren't just sad. They were dangerous. And digging them up was going to cost me more than I could imagine. The thing about digging up the past is that you never really know what you're going to find until it's too late to stop, and by the time you're wrist deep in the dirt, breathing in the dust and rot of everything you thought was long buried, you realize the past isn't dead at all. It's just been waiting, patient and hungry for someone stupid enough to come looking. And as I sat there on the couch that night after Amanda left, clutching the scrap of paper where she had scrawled Mrs. Denton's new address like it was some kind of cursed treasure map, I knew, with that bone-deep certainty that only comes when it's already far too late, that I wasn't going to find closure at the end of this road or even answers, not really, because what I was chasing wasn't justice or understanding or peace, it was something darker, something harder to admit. I was chasing the truth no matter how much it hurt, because lies, even beautiful ones, rot you from the inside out, and I was tired of being hollow. It took me 3 days to work up the nerve to go. 3 days of pacing the living room like a caged animal, of staring at the phone and the car keys and the door as if they might somehow make the decision for me. 3 days of dreaming of Mom's face, not the way she looked at the end, frail, confused, fading, but the way she had looked when I was a kid, strong and stubborn and unbreakable, and wondering if I was about to shatter what little of her I had left. But in the end I had to know. I had to. So on the 4th morning I got in the truck, drove 2 towns over, and found myself parked outside a squat little ranch house with peeling blue paint and a sagging porch, the kind of place where the curtains twitch when a stranger pulls up, and for a long minute I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. Finally I forced myself out, up the walkway and knocked. The door opened almost immediately and there she was, Mrs. Denton, older, grayer, smaller somehow, but still with that same piercing look in her eyes like she could see right through you, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, just stood there measuring each other across the yawning canyon of time. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said. She led me inside without another word, motioning for me to sit on a plastic-covered couch that crackled under my weight, and disappeared into the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee so strong it could have stripped paint off a car. We sipped in silence for a while. Then finally she spoke. "I assume you found out by now." I nodded. "About the will?" I said. She snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. "That's just the beginning," she said, and the way she said it, so sure, so resigned, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told her about the binder. About the letter. About Amanda's warning. And when I finished, Mrs. Denton set her mug down with a heavy thud and leaned forward, elbows on her knees, fixing me with a look that made me feel about 6 years old again. "There are things you don't know about your family," she said. "Things your mother spent her whole life trying to bury." I wanted to tell her I didn't care. I wanted to tell her I just wanted to move on. But we both knew that was a lie. "You need to start with your father," she said. "My father?" I asked, confused. She nodded. "You think he just left, right? Took off one day and never looked back?" I nodded. "That's what Mom had always told us. Dad was weak. Dad was selfish. Dad couldn't handle the responsibility." Mrs. Denton smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was sad. Pitying. "That's not what happened," she said. She told me the story slowly, haltingly, as if the words physically hurt her to say. How my father hadn't left because he wanted to. How he had tried to take Nick with him. How there had been court papers, custody battles, threats. How, in the end, Mom had won not because she was a better parent but because she was better at hiding things. Better at lying. Better at making sure that what needed to be seen was seen, and what needed to stay buried stayed buried. Mrs. Denton didn't know all the details, or if she did, she didn't say, but what she did know painted a picture that made my stomach churn with sick, dawning realization. Mom had fought like hell to keep Nick, to keep control of Nick, in a way she had never fought for me. And Dad? He had tried. God, he had tried. But in the end, he had been forced out, erased, turned into a villain in a story he hadn't even gotten to finish telling. And Nick? Nick had been the prize. Not the child. Not the son. The prize. Something about that word, something about the way it rattled around in my head, made me feel like I was drowning. Because it meant that Mom's love, Mom's loyalty, Mom's endless, suffocating devotion to Nick hadn't been about Nick at all. It had been about winning. And I had just been collateral damage. I drove home in a daze, the world tilting and spinning around me like a carnival ride gone off its rails, Mrs. Denton's voice echoing in my ears. There are things you don't know. I stumbled into the house, Nick's house now legally speaking, and collapsed onto the couch, feeling like the walls were closing in, like the memories were pressing down on me, smothering me. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be enough. Trying to earn a love that had never really been mine to begin with. Trying to patch a hole that had been ripped in our family long before I even understood what a family was supposed to be. And for the first time, a terrible, dangerous thought crept into my mind, whispered so softly I almost missed it. Maybe Mom didn't love either of us. Maybe we were just tools. Weapons. Pawns. Maybe Nick wasn't the golden child after all. Maybe he was just the better investment. And maybe, just maybe, there was something even worse waiting to be uncovered. Something so ugly, so poisonous, that even now, even after everything, I wasn't ready to face it. But it was coming. I could feel it. Like a storm rumbling on the horizon, unseen but inevitable. And this time there would be no hiding from it. It's funny in a way, not funny in the laugh-out-loud sense, but in that sick, hollow, bitter way where your body doesn't know whether to scream or cry, so it just settles somewhere in between. Because all those years I spent thinking the real enemy was distance, thinking that if Nick had just come home, if he had just picked up the damn phone more often or showed up for Christmas or sent a real birthday card instead of a half-hearted text, that somehow we could have salvaged something out of the wreckage, somehow we could have stitched a family out of the tattered scraps we had left. But now, sitting at the kitchen table with Amanda across from me, both of us nursing lukewarm coffee that neither of us had touched, I realized how stupid I had been, because distance hadn't been the enemy, the real enemy had been living right under our roof all along, smiling at us with my mother's face and poisoning everything she touched without us even noticing until it was far, far too late. Amanda had come by after I called her, my voice shaking with something between panic and rage, and without asking any questions she had just shown up like she always did, the way real friends do, and now she was sitting there quietly, watching me unravel with a kind of grim patience, waiting for me to be ready to hear what she had come to say. "You need to see something," she said finally, her voice low and steady, like she was afraid that if she spoke too loudly the truth might shatter the fragile walls of the house. She slid an envelope across the table. Yellowed. Heavy with the weight of things better left buried. I opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a stack of papers. Old court documents, copies of letters, things that must have taken Amanda months to dig up from whatever dark corners of the county archives still remembered people like my family. And at first I didn't understand. There were custody filings just like Mrs. Denton had said. There were records of police visits, loud domestic disturbances, neighbors complaining, nothing ever officially charged. There were hospital records too. Injuries. To Nick. To me. To Mom. Injuries that didn't match the explanations given at the time, falls, accidents, kids being kids. And then, buried at the bottom of the stack, there was a medical report from when I was 6 years old. A psychological evaluation. Of me. Ordered by the court. Requested by my father. Because he had suspected that something wasn't right in our home. Because he had tried to fight for custody. Because he had tried to save me. I stared at the report, the words swimming in front of my eyes, my hands shaking so badly the pages rattled like dry leaves. It described a little boy who was quiet, withdrawn, afraid. It described signs of emotional neglect, signs of manipulation, signs of something darker. Something the evaluator hadn't been willing to put a name to in writing, but which screamed between every carefully chosen line. And the conclusion? The child would benefit from removal from the current home environment, pending further investigation. Removal. From Mom. But that had never happened. Because not long after the report was filed, my father had suddenly dropped the case. Withdrawn all claims. Vanished from our lives without a word. Because he had been threatened. Because Mom, my mother, the woman I had spent my life caring for, sacrificing for, loving even when she forgot who I was, had blackmailed him. Had used Nick. Had used me. Had dangled us like bait and then slammed the door shut when he reached for us. Amanda didn't know all the details. The records were incomplete, redacted, fragmented by time and neglect. But she had pieced together enough to see the shape of the truth. Mom had lied. Not just about Dad. Not just about Nick. About everything. About what our family had been. About what she had been. She hadn't been a victim. She had been the architect. The puppeteer. The warden. I couldn't breathe. I sat there with my head in my hands, the coffee cooling beside me, the papers spread out like a crime scene no one had ever bothered to investigate. Nick had known. Of course he had. He had been older. He had seen more. And at some point, Maybe when he realized he couldn't escape on his own, maybe when he realized love wouldn't save him, he had made a deal. A terrible, unforgivable deal. Stay quiet. Play along. Be the golden child. And in return? Freedom. Money. A future built on the bones of the brother he left behind. Me. That's why he hadn't come back. Not because he didn't care. Not because he was too busy. Because he couldn't look me in the eye without seeing what he had sold. Because he couldn't walk into this house without feeling the walls closing in, whispering the truth he had helped bury. And Mom? Mom had rewarded him. Even after everything. Even after he abandoned her in the end. Because Nick had played his part. He had stayed silent. He had been the good son. And me? I had stayed too. But not by choice. By design. By her design. A built-in caretaker. A built-in jailer. A built-in punishment for sins I hadn't even known I was paying for. The rage that flooded me then wasn't sharp and hot like I expected. It was cold. Heavy. Endless. Like a deep, black ocean stretching out in every direction. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash every fragile thing in the house just to hear it break. I wanted to burn it all down and walk away without looking back. But instead, I sat there, staring at the truth spread out in front of me like the broken pieces of a puzzle I had spent my whole life pretending didn't exist, and I realized that Mom had won even in death. She had gotten exactly what she wanted. A legacy built on silence and sacrifice. On secrets and shame. And worst of all, I had helped her do it. Because I had loved her. Because I had believed her. Because I hadn't asked the right questions until it was far, far too late. Amanda squeezed my hand then, hard enough to anchor me to the moment, and said, her voice low and fierce, "You deserve better. You still do." And for the first time, maybe the first time in my entire life, I let myself believe it. Even just a little. Even just for a moment. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to fight a ghost. I didn't know how to forgive a past that had been built on nothing but lies. But I knew this. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Not for her. Not for Nick. Not for anyone. The truth was out now. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it cost me, I was going to see it through to the end. There's a certain kind of silence that comes after the storm, not the peaceful, cleansing kind you see in movies where the world glistens fresh and new, but a heavier, thicker silence, like the air itself is mourning everything that's been lost. And in the days after Amanda showed me the truth, the whole, ugly, devastating truth, that was the silence I lived in, moving through the house like a ghost, touching familiar things that no longer felt familiar, walking rooms that felt smaller. Somehow, heavier, as if the walls themselves were sagging under the weight of all the secrets they had held for so long. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't break things, though God knows I wanted to. I just existed. A hollow man in a hollow house, surrounded by memories that no longer belonged to me, because once you know the truth, really know it, you can never go back to pretending, can never unsee the cracks spiderwebbing across everything you once held sacred. Nick didn't call. Of course he didn't. I thought about calling him. About confronting him. About demanding answers or apologies, or at least the dignity of a face-to-face betrayal. But what would have been the point? There was nothing he could say that would make it better. Nothing that would give me back the years I had lost, the life I had sacrificed, the mother I had mourned long before she died. Nothing. So instead, I did something else. Something I never thought I would do. I packed. It started small, a box here, a drawer there, but soon the momentum took over, and before I knew it, the living room was filled with the artifacts of a life I was no longer willing to carry. I kept a few things, photographs mostly of better days when the lies hadn't yet settled over everything like a dirty snow, but most of it I left behind. The house. That was Nick's problem now. Let him deal with the sagging roof and the cracked foundation and the endless parade of bills. Let him inherit the ghosts he had helped create. I didn't want it anymore. I didn't want any of it. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. But because sometimes survival means walking away from the burning wreckage with nothing but the clothes on your back and the stubborn, unkillable belief that somewhere out there, there's still something worth saving. Even if it's just yourself. The last thing I did before I left was write a letter. Not to Nick. Not to Mom. To myself. I sat at the scarred kitchen table, the same one where Mom used to sit chain-smoking and filling out crossword puzzles she never finished, and I wrote. You were never invisible. You were never worthless. You stayed when it would have been easier to run. You loved when you had every reason to hate. That's who you are. Not what they tried to make you. Not what they left you with. Enough. I folded the letter, tucked it into my wallet, and walked out the door without looking back. Starting over wasn't easy. God, it wasn't even close. I crashed on Amanda's couch for a while, picked up extra shifts at the hardware store, lived out of a battered duffel bag and wore the same 2 pairs of jeans until the seams gave out. I filed legal papers to challenge the will, not because I wanted the house but because I wanted the record to show that I hadn't gone quietly, hadn't let the lies have the last word, and though the lawyer warned me it was a long shot, just filing the paperwork felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I went to therapy. Sat in a room with a woman who wore sensible shoes and kind eyes and asked me questions I didn't know how to answer. Why did you stay? When did you first learn to disappear? Who taught you that love is something you have to earn? The answers didn't come easy. Sometimes they didn't come at all. But I kept going. Because healing isn't about winning. It's about refusing to quit. Nick. I heard from him once. A terse, bitter voicemail full of bluster and bullshit, blaming me for dragging everything out and ruining what Mom wanted. I didn't call him back. Didn't even save the message. Because the thing about people like Nick, people who survive by stepping on the backs of others, is that they don't understand when someone stops playing their game. They don't understand when the pawn they sacrificed gets up off the board and walks away. And I was done being a pawn. Done playing a rigged game. Done. A year later, I found myself in a little town 2 states over, renting a room above a dusty bookstore, working odd jobs, slowly building a life out of the ashes of the one I left behind. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was mine. All mine. Some nights I sat by the window watching the lights blink out one by one across the quiet streets and thought about Mom, about the woman she was, the woman she could have been, the woman she chose to be, and I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel grief. I just felt sad. Sad for her. Sad for Nick. Sad for all the wasted chances and broken promises and love twisted into something sharp and ugly. But sadness isn't the same as regret. And it sure as hell isn't defeat. Sadness is just the space love leaves behind when it's gone. You mourn it. You honor it. And then you move on. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, one thing I would carve into stone if I could, it's this. Family isn't blood. It's not obligation. It's not sacrifice. It's not the scars you carry from trying to be good enough for people who never deserved you. Family is choice. Family is the people who see you at your worst and stay anyway. Family is the life you build when you finally stop chasing the ghosts of the life you were supposed to have. And me? I'm still building. Still healing. Still standing. Still here. And for the first time in a long, long time, that's enough.